The seeds of the American Civil War were sown long before the first shots were fired. They were embedded in the very foundation of the nation, in a paradox that celebrated liberty while perpetuating the institution of slavery. In the early 19th century, the United States was a nation of stark contrasts. The North was rapidly industrializing, its economy driven by factories, commerce, and a growing immigrant workforce. Society here was more fluid, with a burgeoning middle class and a strong belief in the power of free labor. The South, in stark contrast, remained overwhelmingly agrarian. Its economy was dominated by large plantations cultivating cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar, all of which were heavily reliant on the labor of enslaved African Americans. This peculiar institution, as it was euphemistically called, was not just an economic system. It was the bedrock of Southern society, shaping its culture, politics, and identity. The planter class, a wealthy elite who owned the majority of slaves, held immense political power and defended slavery as a necessary and even benevolent institution. For decades, a fragile peace was maintained through a series of political compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state but balanced it with the admission of Maine as a free state, and prohibited slavery in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase Territory. This act drew a line across the continent, a temporary solution to a problem that refused to disappear: the issue of slavery's expansion into new territories, acquired by the United States, became the central political battle of the era. With each new state added to the Union, the delicate balance of power between free and slave states in the Senate was threatened. Southerners feared that if the free states gained a majority, they would use their power to abolish slavery altogether. Northerners, on the other hand, were increasingly opposed to the spread of slavery, viewing it as a moral blight and a threat to the principles of a free republic. The rhetoric on both sides grew more heated. Abolitionists in the North, once a fringe group, gained prominence with fiery orators like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose powerful speeches and writings exposed the brutal realities of bondage. They called for the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of all slaves, a demand that was met with outrage and fear in the South in the 1850s. The simmering tensions reached a boiling point. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, but included a stringent new Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. This law was deeply resented in the North and led to numerous instances of resistance and defiance. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed the settlers of these new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, a principle known as popular sovereignty. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened the door for slavery to expand into areas where it had long been prohibited. The result was a bloody prelude to the Civil War. As pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flocked to Kansas, each determined to control the territory's destiny. The ensuing violence, which earned the territory the name Bleeding Kansas, was a horrifying glimpse of the national conflict to come. The Supreme Court's dread, Scott's decision in 1857, further inflamed passions. The court ruled that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. It also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, asserting that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. The decision was a stunning victory for the South and a devastating blow to the anti-slavery movement. It seemed to confirm the fears of many Northerners that a slave power conspiracy was at work to make slavery a national institution in 1859. A radical abolitionist named John Brown took matters into his own hands. He led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to seize weapons and incite a massive slave rebellion. The raid failed, and Brown was captured, tried for treason, and hanged. In the North, many hailed him as a martyr for freedom. In the South, he was seen as a dangerous terrorist, and his actions intensified fears of slave insurrections and Northern aggression. The presidential election of 1860 would be the final spark. The newly formed Republican Party, which was staunchly opposed to the expansion of slavery, nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, fractured along sectional lines, with Northern Democrats nominating Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats nominating John C. Breckinridge. A fourth candidate, John Bell, ran on the Constitutional Union ticket, which simply called for preserving the Union. Lincoln won the election with a majority of the electoral votes, but he did not carry a single Southern state. For the South, his victory was the final proof that they had lost their voice in the national government and that their way of life was under imminent threat. One by one, Southern states began to secede from the Union, starting with South Carolina. In December 1860, by February 1861, 7 states had formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The House was now irrevocably divided. The stage was set for war. The first shots of the American Civil War were fired not in a grand battle, but on a small, fortified island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, a federal installation, became the symbol of the divided nation's first great crisis. As Southern states seceded, they began to seize federal properties within their borders: forts, arsenals, and custom houses. But Fort Sumter, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, held out for the newly formed Confederacy. The presence of a Union garrison in one of its most important harbors was an affront to its sovereignty. For President Lincoln, surrendering the fort would be a tacit recognition of the Confederacy's legitimacy. He was determined to hold it. As the weeks ticked by, the situation grew more tense. Major Anderson's supplies were dwindling, and he would soon be forced to surrender without resupply. Lincoln, in a shrewd political move, informed the governor of South Carolina that he would be sending an unarmed naval expedition to resupply the fort. This placed the onus of starting the war squarely on the Confederacy. If they fired on the supply ships, they would be the aggressors. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet decided they could not allow the fort to be resupplied. They issued an ultimatum to Major Anderson: surrender the fort or face attack. Anderson refused. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell from a Confederate battery arched high into the pre-dawn darkness and exploded over Fort Sumter. For the next 34 hours, Confederate cannons ringing the harbor bombarded the fort. The Union garrison, outgunned and undersupplied, returned fire, but their efforts were largely ineffective. The bombardment was a spectacle for the citizens of Charleston, who gathered on their rooftops to watch the historic event. Miraculously, there were no combat fatalities during the bombardment. The only deaths occurred after Anderson's surrender, when a cannon salute to the flag went awry, killing 2 Union soldiers. On April 14th, Major Anderson and his men lowered the tattered American flag and evacuated the fort. The Civil War had begun. The attack on Fort Sumter electrified the nation. In the North, The firing on the American flag was seen as an act of rebellion and treason. A wave of patriotic fervor swept across the free states. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion was met with an overwhelming response. Men rushed to enlist, eager to defend the Union. The reaction in the South was equally fervent. The Confederate victory at Fort Sumter was a cause for celebration and a powerful symbol of their defiance. For more southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded and joined the Confederacy. The border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, all of which had slavery but had not yet seceded, became critical. Strategic prizes for both sides. The first major battle of the war took place on July 21, 1861, near a small creek called Bull Run in northern Virginia. The Union Army, under the command of General Irvin McDowell, was confident of a quick victory. Many soldiers had enlisted for only 90 days, believing the war would be over in a single battle. Civilians from Washington, D.C., including congressmen and their families, rode out in carriages with picnic baskets to watch the spectacle. The battle began well for the Union as they pushed back the Confederate forces, but the tide turned when Confederate reinforcements arrived by train. A novel use of technology in warfare. Under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, and with the steadfast stand of General Thomas J. Jackson, who earned his famous nickname Stonewall at this battle, the Confederates launched a fierce counterattack. The inexperienced Union troops, exhausted and demoralized, broke and fled in a panicked retreat back to Washington. The retreat was a chaotic and humiliating spectacle, with soldiers and civilians alike clogging the roads. The Confederates were too disorganized to pursue their victory and capture the Union capital, a missed opportunity that would haunt them. Later in the war, the First Battle of Bull Run was a sobering wake-up call for the North. It shattered the illusion of a short and glorious war. The defeat spurred the Union to redouble its efforts, and Lincoln called for a massive new army of 500,000 men. The battle also gave the Confederacy a surge of confidence, reinforcing their belief that they could win their independence. The war would not be a brief affair. It would be a long, brutal, and bloody struggle. While the early battles in the East captured much of the public's attention, a series of crucial campaigns were unfolding in the vast territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. The war in the West was a war for control of the great rivers, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Cumberland, which were vital arteries of transportation and communication. Control of these rivers would allow the Union to split the Confederacy in two and disrupt its supply lines. In early 1862, a little-known Union general named Ulysses S. Grant began a campaign that would change the course of the war. Grant was a quiet, unassuming man, but he possessed a relentless determination and a clear understanding of military strategy. In February, he captured two key Confederate forts in Tennessee, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The capture of Fort Donelson was particularly significant. When the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant's blunt reply became famous: "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." This earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender. Grant and made him a hero in the North. The fall of these forts forced the Confederates to abandon much of Tennessee and opened the way for a Union advance deep into the South. Grant then moved his army southward along the Tennessee River to a place called Pittsburgh Landing. He was planning to link up with another Union army and then attack the major Confederate railroad hub at Corinth. Mississippi, but the Confederate commander in the West, General Albert Sidney Johnston, a man widely regarded as one of the finest soldiers in America, had other plans. He decided to launch a surprise attack on Grant's army before the reinforcements could arrive. On the morning of April 6, 1862, thousands of Confederate soldiers stormed out of the woods and slammed into the unsuspecting Union camps near a small log church called Shiloh. The fighting that ensued was some of the most brutal and chaotic of the entire war. For hours, the battle raged in dense woods, tangled thickets, and open fields. At one point, the fighting centered on a sunken road that became known as the Hornet's Nest, where a small group of Union soldiers held off repeated Confederate assaults for hours, buying valuable time for Grant to rally his shattered army. By the end of the first day, the Union Army had been pushed back to the banks of the Tennessee River, and it seemed as if they were on the verge of a catastrophic defeat. General Johnston was killed in the fighting, a devastating blow to the Confederacy. That night, a terrible storm raged as the wounded and dying lay on the battlefield. But Grant was not defeated. "We'll lick 'em tomorrow," he told his staff. During the night, the reinforcements he had been waiting for arrived. The next morning, Grant launched a massive counterattack. The weary and disorganized Confederates were pushed back, and by the afternoon they were in full retreat. The Battle of Shiloh was a Union victory, but it came at a staggering cost. The two-day battle resulted in over 23,000 casualties, more than in all of America's previous wars combined. The horrific slaughter shocked the nation and made it clear that the war would be a long and bloody affair. Following the victory at Shiloh, the Union continued its campaign to control the Mississippi River. In April, a Union naval fleet under the command of Admiral David Farragut steamed past the forts guarding the mouth of the Mississippi and captured the city of New Orleans, the Confederacy's largest city and most important port. The only remaining Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi was the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Perched on high bluffs overlooking a sharp bend in the river, Vicksburg was a natural fortress, and its cannons commanded the river for miles. As long as Vicksburg held out, the Confederacy could still transport men and supplies across the Mississippi. In the spring of 1863, General Grant launched a brilliant and audacious campaign to capture Vicksburg. After a series of failed attempts to take the city by direct assault, Grant marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, crossed the river south of the city, and then swept eastward, cutting Vicksburg off from the rest of the Confederacy. For 6 weeks, Grant's army laid siege to the city, subjecting its defenders and civilian population to constant bombardment. Inside Vicksburg, conditions became desperate. Food ran out, and the people were reduced to eating mules, rats, and even shoe leather. On July 4, 1863, the day after the great Union victory at Gettysburg in the East, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg, General John C. Pemberton, surrendered his army to Grant. The capture of Vicksburg was a major turning point in the war. It gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. It also solidified Grant's reputation as the Union's most successful general, and set the stage for his eventual appointment as commander of all Union armies. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. While Grant was winning victories in the West, the war in the East was a story of frustration and stalemate for the Union. The main Union army in the East, the Army of the Potomac, was a formidable fighting force, but it was plagued by a series of cautious and indecisive commanders. The first of these was General George B. McClellan, a brilliant organizer and administrator who built the Army of the Potomac into a superb fighting machine. But McClellan was also overly cautious and consistently overestimated the strength of the enemy. He was reluctant to commit his army to battle unless he was certain of victory. In the spring of 1862, McClellan launched a massive campaign to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Instead of marching overland, he transported his army by sea to the peninsula between the York and James rivers, a plan that he believed would allow him to bypass the main Confederate army. The campaign started well, but McClellan's characteristic caution slowed his advance, giving the Confederates time to reinforce their defenses. The Confederate army, under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston, was pushed back to the outskirts of Richmond, but then Johnston was wounded, and command of the Army of Northern Virginia passed to a man who would become one of the most revered and brilliant military commanders in American history, Robert E. Lee. Lee was a Virginian who had been offered command of the Union Army at the start of the war, but he could not bring himself to fight against his home state. He was a master of strategy and tactics, and he possessed an audacious and aggressive spirit that stood in stark contrast to McClellan's caution. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee attacked McClellan's army relentlessly. Although Lee's army suffered heavier casualties, he succeeded in driving McClellan away from Richmond and saving the Confederate capital. Lee then turned his attention northward. At the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, he won a decisive victory over another Union army, clearing the way for an invasion of the North. Lee hoped that a victory on northern soil would demoralize the Union, convince Great Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, and perhaps even force Lincoln to sue for peace. In September 1862, Lee's army crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, but his invasion plans were discovered by the Union when a copy of his orders was found wrapped around a bundle of cigars. McClellan, now knowing Lee's plans, moved to intercept him. The two armies met at Antietam Creek. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest day in American history. In a series of brutal and uncoordinated attacks, the Union Army assaulted Lee's positions along the creek. The fighting raged for 12 hours in places like the cornfield, the sunken road which became known as Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge. By the end of the day, over 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The battle was a tactical draw, but it was a strategic victory for the Union. Lee's invasion was halted, and he was forced to retreat back to Virginia. The victory at Antietam gave President Lincoln the opportunity he had been waiting for. For months, he had been wrestling with the idea of issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had always hated slavery, but his primary goal at the start of the war was to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. He feared that an Emancipation Proclamation would alienate the border states and a large segment of the northern population. But as the war dragged on, Lincoln came to believe that emancipation was a military necessity. Slaves were being used by the Confederacy to build fortifications, transport supplies, and grow food for the army. Freeing the slaves would weaken the Confederate war effort. Emancipation would also give the Union a moral cause to fight for, making it less likely that Britain and France, which had abolished slavery themselves, would intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in the states that were still in rebellion against the United States would would be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation was a revolutionary document. It transformed the character of the war. It was no longer just a war to preserve the Union. It was now a war to end slavery. The proclamation did not free all the slaves, did not apply to the border states, or to the parts of the Confederacy that were already under Union control, but it was a promise of freedom, and it opened the door for the enlistment of African American soldiers into the Union Army by the end of the war. Nearly 200,000 African American men would serve in the Union Army and Navy. They fought with courage and distinction in battles like Fort Wagner and the Battle of the Crater, and their service was a crucial contribution to the Union victory. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the struggle for freedom, and a giant leap toward the fulfillment of the nation's founding ideals. Following Antietam, Lincoln replaced the overly cautious McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. In December 1862, Burnside launched a disastrous frontal assault against Lee's well-entrenched army at the Battle of Fredericksburg. The Union Army suffered horrific casualties, and the defeat sent Northern morale plummeting. Burnside was replaced by General Joseph, fighting Joe Hooker, who was confident that he could defeat Lee. But at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, Lee, outnumbered 2-1, won his most brilliant victory. In a daring and risky move, he divided his army and sent Stonewall Jackson on a long march to attack the Union flank. The surprise attack was a stunning success, but it came at a terrible cost. Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men and died a few days later. His death was a devastating blow to Lee and the Confederacy. Despite his victory, Lee's army was in desperate need of supplies. He decided to launch another invasion of the North, hoping to relieve the pressure on war-torn Virginia, gather supplies, and win a decisive victory that would end the war. In June 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia once again crossed the Potomac River and marched into Pennsylvania. The stage was set for the greatest battle of the war. In the summer of 1863, the war reached its dramatic and bloody climax in the small, quiet town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, would be the largest and most costly battle ever fought in North America, and it would prove to be the turning point of the war. The battle began almost by accident. A Confederate infantry brigade, searching for a rumored supply of shoes in Gettysburg, encountered a Union cavalry detachment on the morning of July 1st. The fighting quickly escalated as both sides rushed reinforcements to the scene. For most of the first day, the Confederates had the upper hand, pushing the Union forces back through the town of Gettysburg and onto a series of hills and ridges to the south. The Union Army, now under the command of General George Meade, who had replaced Hooker just a few days earlier, established a strong defensive position along a fishhook-shaped line of hills that included Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and a long ridge known as Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate Army, under the command of Robert E. Lee, occupied a parallel line along Cemetery Ridge to the west. On the second day of the battle, Lee launched a series of attacks on the Union flanks. The fighting was fierce and desperate, particularly on the Union left, where Confederate forces under General James Longstreet tried to seize a rocky hill called Little Round Top, the timely arrival of a Union brigade under Colonel Joshua Lawrence. Chamberlain, who ordered a daring bayonet charge when his men ran out of ammunition, saved the Union flank and perhaps the entire battle. By the end of the second day, the Union line had bent, but had not broken. Lee's army had suffered heavy casualties. and had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. But Lee was not deterred. He was convinced that one more great effort could shatter the Union Army and win the war. On the third day, Lee decided to launch a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. His plan was to precede the infantry, attack with a massive artillery bombardment that would soften up the Union defenses. At around 1 p.m., more than 150 Confederate cannons opened fire in what was likely the largest artillery barrage of the war. For 2 hours, the cannons roared, shaking the ground and filling the air with smoke and the shriek of shells. The Union artillery returned fire, and the two armies engaged in a thunderous duel. After the bombardment, at around 3 p.m., some 12,500 Confederate soldiers, under the command of General George Pickett, emerged from the woods on Seminary Ridge and began to march across the open fields toward the Union line, a mile away. This was Pickett's charge, one of the most famous and tragic events in American military history. The Confederate soldiers marched in perfect order, their battle flags waving in the breeze. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight. But as they crossed the open ground, they were met with a storm of Union artillery and rifle fire. The Confederate lines were torn apart, but they continued to advance. A small group of Confederates, led by General Lewis Armistead, managed to breach the Union line at a stone wall that became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But they were quickly repulsed, and the attack collapsed. The survivors of Pickett's charge streamed back across the fields, leaving behind thousands of their comrades who were killed or wounded. The charge had been a catastrophic failure. As the shattered remnants of his army returned, Lee rode out to meet them, taking the blame for the disaster upon himself. "It is all my fault," he said. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. It was a decisive victory for the Union, but it came at a terrible price. In 3 days of fighting, there were more than 51,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle of the war. Lee's army was shattered, and he would never again have the strength to launch a major invasion of the North. On July 4th, the same day that Vicksburg surrendered to Grant in the West, Lee began his long and sorrowful retreat back to Virginia. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg were a major turning point in the war. They boosted Northern morale and put the Confederacy on the defensive for the remainder of the conflict. A few months later, in November 1863, a ceremony was held to dedicate a national cemetery for the soldiers who had died at Gettysburg. President Lincoln was invited to deliver a few appropriate remarks. The main speaker of the day, a famous orator named Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose to speak. In a short 2-minute speech, he delivered one of the most powerful and eloquent addresses in American history. The Gettysburg Address redefined the meaning of the war. Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom and of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that would not perish from the earth. He reminded the nation that the war was a struggle not just to preserve the Union, but to ensure that the principles of liberty and equality upon which the nation was founded would endure. The Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in the summer of 1863 were a major turning point. But the war was far from over. In the spring of 1864, President Lincoln, frustrated with the string of ineffective generals in the East, made a momentous decision. He appointed Ulysses S. Grant as the General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant was a different kind of general. He was not a flashy strategist like Lee, but he was a relentless and determined fighter who understood that the war could only be won by destroying the Confederate armies. He devised a plan to launch a coordinated series of attacks on the Confederacy. with the main effort being a campaign by the Army of the Potomac, under his direct supervision, to destroy Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In May 1864, Grant's army, some 120,000 strong, crossed the Rapidan River and entered a dense, tangled wilderness of scrub oak and thick underbrush, known simply as the Wilderness. Lee, with an army half the size, moved to intercept him. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought on May 5th and 6th, was a brutal and horrifying affair. The dense woods made it impossible for either side to maintain formations or to see the enemy. The fighting was at close quarters, and the dry underbrush caught fire, creating a hellish landscape of smoke, flames, and the screams of wounded men. The battle was a tactical draw, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the past, after such a bloody and inconclusive battle, the Union Army would have retreated. But Grant was not like his predecessors. On the night of May 7th, he ordered his army to move not north, but south, toward the strategic crossroads of Spotsylvania Courthouse. The Union soldiers, realizing they were not retreating, broke into cheers. They knew that in Grant, they finally had a commander who would not give up. For the next 6 weeks, the armies of Grant and Lee were locked in a brutal and unrelenting struggle. The Overland Campaign was a continuous series of battles, from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse, to the North Anna River, to Cold Harbor. It was a war of attrition, with Grant using his superior numbers to constantly attack Lee's army and grind it down. The fighting at Spotsylvania was particularly savage, especially at a salient in the Confederate lines known as the Mule Shoe. For nearly 24 hours, the two sides fought hand-to-hand in the rain and mud, in some of the most intense combat of the war. The fighting was so fierce that a 22-inch oak tree was cut down by rifle fire at Cold Harbor, just a few miles from Richmond. Grant made a costly mistake. He ordered a frontal assault on Lee's well-entrenched positions, and in a matter of minutes, some 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. The attack was a catastrophic failure, and Grant would later say that it was the one attack he wished he had never ordered. Despite the heavy losses, Grant continued to push southward. His strategy was to force Lee into a siege at Richmond, where his superior numbers and resources would eventually wear the Confederacy down. In mid-June, Grant's army crossed the James River and moved to attack Petersburg, a vital railroad hub. South of Richmond, the capture of Petersburg would cut off the supply lines to the Confederate capital and force Lee to abandon it. But the Union Army failed to take Petersburg by assault, and the two armies settled into a long and brutal siege that would last for 10 months. The siege of Petersburg was a grim and grueling affair, a precursor to the trench warfare of World War I. Both sides dug elaborate networks of trenches and fortifications, and the soldiers endured months of sniper fire, artillery bombardments, and disease. The Overland Campaign was a costly one for the Union. In just over a month, Grant's army suffered some 55,000 casualties, but the campaign was a strategic success. Grant had inflicted heavy losses on Lee's army, losses that the Confederacy could not replace, and he had pinned Lee down at Petersburg, setting the stage for the final act of the war, while Grant was fighting in Virginia. Another Union army, under the command of General William Tecumseh Sherman, was advancing into Georgia. Sherman, like Grant, believed in the concept of total war. He understood that to win the war, the Union had to break the will of the Southern people to fight. In May 1864, Sherman began his Atlanta campaign, In a series of brilliant flanking maneuvers, he forced the Confederate Army under General Joseph E. Johnston to retreat southward toward Atlanta. In July, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, frustrated with Johnston's defensive strategy, replaced him with the more aggressive John Bell Hood, who'd launched a series of attacks on Sherman's army, but they were all repulsed with heavy losses. On September 2, 1864, Sherman's army captured the city of Atlanta, a major industrial and railroad center. The fall of Atlanta was a major blow to the Confederacy and a huge boost to Northern morale. It came at a critical time for President Lincoln, who was facing a tough re-election campaign. Many in the North were weary of the war and the heavy casualties, and Lincoln's chances of victory seemed slim. But the news of Atlanta's fall helped to turn the tide, and in November, Lincoln was re-elected by a large margin. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman embarked on his famous march to the sea. He cut his army loose from its supply lines and marched 300 miles to the coastal city of Savannah, living off the land and destroying everything of military value in his path. Sherman's army cut a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction across Georgia, tearing up railroad tracks, burning factories and plantations, and confiscating food and livestock. Sherman's march to the sea was a brutal but effective application of total war. It brought the war home to the Southern people and shattered their will to resist. In late December, Sherman's army reached Savannah, and he presented the city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The end of the war was now in sight. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was on the verge of collapse. The Union blockade had choked off its supplies, its armies were depleted and demoralized, and its economy was in ruins. In the trenches around Petersburg, Lee's once proud army of Northern Virginia was a shadow of its former self, a ragged and starving force that was outnumbered by Grant's army by more than 2 to 1. On April 1, 1865, Grant's army finally broke through Lee's lines at the Battle of Five Forks. The next day, Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate government fled the capital, and on April 3, Union troops, including a brigade of African-American soldiers, marched into Richmond. As they marched through the streets, they were greeted by cheering crowds of newly freed slaves. President Lincoln himself visited the fallen Confederate capital a few days later. Walking through the streets to the applause of the liberated African-American population, Lee's army, now in a desperate retreat, tried to escape to the west, hoping to link up with another Confederate army in North Carolina. But Grant's army pursued them relentlessly, cutting off their escape routes and constantly harassing their rear guard. On April 9, 1865, Lee's army was surrounded by Union forces at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. Lee knew that his situation was hopeless. He had no choice but to surrender. That afternoon, Lee, in his finest uniform, met with Grant, who was dressed in a mud-spattered private's uniform, in the parlor of a house owned by a man named Wilmer McLean. In a strange twist of fate, McLean had moved to Appomattox to escape the war after the First Battle of Bull Run had been fought on his farm in Northern Virginia. The terms of surrender were generous. Grant allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and sidearms, and he provided them with rations to help them on their journey home. He understood that the goal was not to punish the South, but to begin the difficult process of healing and reconciliation. As the Confederate soldiers laid down their arms, there were no cheers from the Union ranks. Grant had ordered his men to be silent, to show respect for their defeated countrymen. The surrender at Appomattox was the effective end of the Civil War. The remaining Confederate armies surrendered in the weeks that followed. The long and bloody struggle was finally over, but the joy of victory was soon turned to sorrow. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. A well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln was carried to a house across the street, where he died the next morning. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a national tragedy. It robbed the nation of the one man who, with his wisdom, compassion, and moral authority, was best equipped to lead the country through the difficult process of Reconstruction. The Civil War was the most traumatic and transformative event in American history. It had preserved the Union and ended the institution of slavery, but it came at a terrible cost. More than 620,000 soldiers had died, more than in all of America's other wars combined. The South was devastated, its economy in ruins, and its society in turmoil. The end of the war brought an end to slavery, but it did not bring an end to the struggle for racial equality. The years of Reconstruction that followed were a time of great promise and great disappointment. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship to African Americans, and gave them the right to vote. But the promise of these amendments was not fully realized for another century. The Civil War had answered the fundamental question of whether the United States was a collection of sovereign states or an indivisible nation. It had affirmed the principle of a strong national government and had set the country on a path toward becoming a global power. And it had, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, given the nation a new birth of freedom. The struggle to define and expand that freedom would continue long after the guns of the Civil War had fallen silent. The legacy of the war, its triumphs, and its tragedies continues to shape the American nation to this day.